Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. Honestly, the 2022 season has felt like kind of a letdown thus far. Through the first 9 weeks, at the halfway point of the year, it felt like something was missing. The games were close on the whole. In fact, it's the closest that games have ever been on average. The door is wide open in a ton of playoff races, and this season has been wildly unpredictable, with teams like the Giants, Jets, and Seahawks coming out of nowhere to do well, and teams like the Rams, Packers, and Broncos coming out of nowhere to stink. But something just feels off. The quality of play just is insanely sloppy. Coaches seem to be doing more stupid things than I can remember in quite some time. It used to be a struggle to think of anything that was worthy of dumb decisions. And now, there are some weeks where I have to choose which ones I want to do. And even though games are close, there haven't exactly been any great games that we're going to be talking about for a very long time. And then, Week 10 happened. Because holy cow, that was awesome. This felt like what we've been waiting for this whole time. After having a ton of great Sundays last year, especially Week 18, which I contend was the best week for games in NFL history, this was the first Sunday that felt on par with that incredible 2021 season. And the main reason why? Well, it had to do with two games in particular. It had to do with the early 1 o'clock game between the Buffalo Bills and the Minnesota Vikings, and it had to do with the late game for America's Game of the Week at 4:25 between the Dallas Cowboys and the Green Bay Packers. Somehow, with the 100+ games that have been played so far in 2022, we got the two best games of the year back to back. Let's start with what happened at 1 o'clock, for those who aren't watching this in the immediate aftermath of the game. And let's talk about that Bills-Vikings game, which the Vikings won by a final score of 33-30. I mean, I'm still trying to process, just like you guys are, what the heck that game was. This was one of the greatest regular season games of the 21st century, and I hate recency bias, but I am more than comfortable saying that. With the Bills holding on to a 27-10 lead late in the third quarter, somehow, the Vikings clawed their way back into it, kept their hopes alive with one of the greatest catches of all time by Justin Jefferson on 4th and 18, lost hope after a failed quarterback sneak attempt on 4th down, then got their hope back after Josh Allen fumbled a subsequent snap, when the Bills literally would have won the game if he just fell forward, then lost hope again after the Bills drove down the field to tie it up with a 29-yard field goal by Tyler Bass, then won it in overtime on a 33-yard field goal by Greg Joseph, and an interception when Buffalo got the ball back. No matter what I say, I cannot accurately do it justice, especially since I can't show the clips of this sequence due to copyright reasons, which is why I'm just showing Vikings highlights that took place before that crazy chain of events. The game was so crazy that it literally broke the win probability chart that ESPN has. And for Numberfire, whose win probability chart was somehow working, it looked more like a heart rate monitor than an actual win probability display. And if you thought that game was crazy, then man, you were in for a treat immediately afterwards, when at 4:25, the Green Bay Packers hosted the Dallas Cowboys. I've talked about this game in a previous video of mine, so if you want to learn more about it and how it ended, click the card in the upper right corner. However, much like the Vikings-Bills game, it featured a stunning lead change, with the favored Cowboys jumping out to a 28-14 lead entering the fourth quarter, only for the Packers to tie it at 28 apiece, and then win it in overtime by a final score of 31-28, following a Mason Crosby field goal and an incredibly questionable decision on the other side by Cowboys head coach Mike McCarthy. This would have been the best game of the entire season if it wasn't for the game that took place right before it. But the craziest part about all this, from a broadcasting perspective and a national perspective, these two games were the doubleheader games. The Bills-Vikings game was the national 1 o'clock game on Fox, being aired to the majority of the country and using Fox's number 2 broadcasting team. And the Cowboys-Packers game was the national 4:25 game on Fox, being aired to just about the entire country and using Fox's number 1 broadcasting team. You didn't need to flip channels. You didn't need to touch your remote. You didn't need to have a Sunday ticket. And you didn't need any additional device to watch this madness unfold. If you just left Fox on, depending on where you were in the country, odds are you would have seen both games of the doubleheader. You would have not only seen two great games, but two games that went into overtime, meaning that you got to see 7 hours of not commercial-free football, but still incredibly exciting football. And that got me to thinking, was this the best national doubleheader of all time? In the history of the NFL, of all the networks to have the doubleheader, was this the best that this has ever been done, where the national 1 o'clock game from the network is incredible, and the national 4 o'clock game from the network straight after is also incredible? Well, I did some digging. And folks, something like what happened this week is almost unprecedented. We're talking about an event that doesn't happen often, and might not happen again for a very long time. Because when you break it down, Week 10 of the 2022 season, in particular its doubleheader on Fox, was historically good. Here's the criteria that I looked at. First, I went through every single week of every single season since 1974, so going back nearly 50 years. While that might seem like an arbitrary cutoff date, it's not. 1974 was the first season that overtime existed in the regular season. Prior to that, if a regular season game ended with the two teams tied after 4 quarters, that was it, and no overtime period was played. Then, I looked at weeks where there were at least 2 games that went into overtime, with one of them being in the early window at 1 o'clock, and the other one being in the later window at 4 o'clock. In other words, I wanted to look at weeks where you got free football for both games. You had no break in the action going from the first game to the second game, and you got to watch more football than you thought you would at the end of the second game. If you usually watch a doubleheader, there will be a bit of a break in the action between the games where they cut to the studio and maybe do on-field interviews. However, if the game goes into overtime, they don't do that. They don't have time to do that, because they just cut straight to the next game. That's what I'm looking for here. And number 3, and by far the hardest part, for any weeks that might have qualified, I looked to see if they were the national games, as in, the game being shown to a majority of the country. There are plenty of weeks where you had 2 overtime games on the same network that took place at 2 different times. However, for the purposes of this, it means nothing if the country can't see it over the air. As an example, in Week 5 of the 2004 season, Fox had a doubleheader, where the game between the Vikings and Texans at 1 o'clock went into overtime, and the game at 4:15 between the Cardinals and 49ers also went into overtime. However, neither of those games on Fox were national games. They were way at the bottom of the pecking order, as most of the country saw Giants Cowboys at 1 o'clock and Panthers Broncos or Rams Seahawks at 4:15. These had to be national games, like Bills Vikings was, and like Cowboys Packers was. To figure this out, there were a variety of methods that I used, including 506 Sports and their coverage maps and archival database, to newspaper articles from markets that are traditionally unaffiliated and typically just show the best game of the week since they have no ties to any team, to broadcasting depth charts from each year. Believe me when I say, this took a ton of time to figure out who had the doubleheader. And yes, I fully admit that this is not the best way in measuring how good a week is. It's a good start, but there are obvious flaws. It obviously wasn't the case this week, since Bills Vikings and Cowboys Packers were the top 2 games of the year. But just because a game goes into overtime doesn't make it great. And just because a game does go into overtime doesn't make it not great. I don't think anyone would argue that the 2019 wildcard game between the Bills and the Texans, which went into overtime, was a better game than the Minneapolis Miracle 2017 divisional between the Vikings and the Saints, which did not go into overtime. It is not a perfect metric by any means whatsoever. However, it might be as good as we've got for the purposes of this. So with that being said, in terms of a national doubleheader on the same network, where both games went into overtime, aside from this past week with Bills, Vikings, and Cowboys, Packers, it's happened a grand total of 2 times. That's it. The last time it happened before this was 25 years ago during Week 9 of the 1997 season on NBC. At 1 o'clock, the Denver Broncos traveled to Buffalo to take on the Bills, while at 4 o'clock, the Jacksonville Jaguars, in a rematch of their controversial Monday Night Football game from earlier in the season, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, traveled to Pittsburgh to take on the Steelers. The Broncos-Bills game was absolutely chaotic. The Broncos led it 20-0 in the fourth quarter, and if NBC wanted to, they legally could have pulled the plug and switched it to a more competitive game. However, the Bills scored 20 straight points, tied it at 20 apiece, and sent it into overtime, where the Broncos would survive a scare and win it 23-20 on a 33-yard field goal by Jason Elam. It was an incredibly sloppy game with 9 turnovers in total, but it was a crazy fun game nonetheless. And the Jaguars-Steelers game was a great installment in the rivalry. The Jaguars led it 10-0 at the half, but the Steelers came back, tied it at 17 apiece with 2 minutes left in regulation, and then won it in overtime after Jerome Bettis scored on a 17-yard touchdown pass from Cordell Stewart. Prior to this past Sunday, this was the last time that both games of a national doubleheader went into overtime. I should also note that at 8 o'clock that day on NBC, they had Game 7 of the World Series between the Cleveland Indians and the Florida Marlins, and that ended on a walk-off, so they were killing it that day. And the only other time this happened was in Week 18 of the 1993 season, once again happening on NBC. At 1 o'clock, it seemed as though the country either got the Steelers-Browns game, or they got this AFC East game right here between the New England Patriots and the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins needed to win this one in order to make the playoffs. If they lost, then following a 9-2 start, they would miss the playoffs in one of the biggest regular season collapses of all time. And sure enough, in a back-and-forth affair where there were 3 lead changes and 2 game-tying scores in the fourth quarter alone, the game was tied at 27 apiece heading into overtime. That's when Drew Bledsoe found Michael Timpson on a 36-yard touchdown pass to end it, and crush Miami's playoff hopes in stunning fashion. Many consider this game to be one of the craziest final week games ever, and it's not hard to see why, considering the circumstances and considering how it played out on the field. And then, at 4 o'clock, you had a big game in the playoff picture from a seeding perspective, and possibly even a making the field perspective, between the Denver Broncos and the Los Angeles Raiders. After Denver looked like they were in cruise control, leading 27-10 at one point in the first half, and 30-13 midway through the third quarter, the Raiders scored 17 straight in regulation to tie it at 30 apiece, including the game-tying touchdown on the pass from Jeff Hostetler to Alexander Wright from 4 yards out with just 5 seconds left. The Raiders then won it 33-30 in overtime, meaning that the Broncos would not get a home wildcard game, and instead would have to travel back to Los Angeles to play the Raiders in the wildcard round. For each of these 3 weeks, you can make an argument for any of them being the best week of the bunch from the national doubleheader standpoint. The stakes in 1993 were higher than the stakes in 1997 or 2022, just because of where it fell in the season. But 2022 had 2 comebacks that were almost impossible, considering the circumstances with the Bills having not lost a game at home when leading by 14 or more at the half since 1968, and the Cowboys having never lost a game ever when leading by 14 points or more entering the fourth quarter. On one hand, neither of the 2022 games ended with a walk-off touchdown. But on the other hand, nothing in any of the other games comes even close to what happened in Vikings-Bills at the end of regulation. And no play in any of those games comes close to the play that Justin Jefferson made on 4th and 18. Long story short, you can absolutely make the argument based on this criteria, with no recency bias whatsoever, that this past Sunday had the best national doubleheader of all time. Sometimes, as a network, you draw the short end of the stick. And sometimes, like Fox did, you strike gold. And it's clear that Fox did just that here. Because not only was this doubleheader historically good, but considering it's been a quarter of a century since the last time we had back-to-back national overtime games on the same network, we might not see a doubleheader like this for a long, long time. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.